Previously, in Hedge Knights, Megahoof informed the community the next step to better understanding the pollution-absorbing trees would take him out of the glade. But he wouldn't depart until the walls and windmill were constructed, so the masons got to work. Another raid was repelled, but not after the gates were damaged and caught fire. Sapo milled wheat and baked bread for the first time. The curtain wall and windmill did get finished, so Megahoof took 2 bison and departed in search of other trees to study. He named the unique tree Salix, and after carefully studying it, he cut a slab of it and then set off homebound. Episode 13: Comforts of the Keep. The members of the Bison Glade waited expectantly for Megahoof's return. The harvest of maki and wheat far exceeded Sapo and Lazarus's expectations. In order to store the crop, Lazarus asked Judea to build many more storage shelves, and once she thought they had enough, build some more. Judea rearranged the keep's shelves in order to make way for even more storage. She roughly gauged the quantity of crops left out in the field and quickly realized the scope of Lazarus's request. The Adlets were outgrowing their modest little keep, but without being able to harness the power of the trees, they couldn't expand any further. Megahoof awoke, having spent a night sleeping on the ground in a small clearing in one of Gatraro's many glades. He had become accustomed to the comforts of the keep, and eagerly set out with his 2 bison to make the half-day's journey back home. Lazarus spotted Megahoof cresting a distant hill, and let Judea know she needn't worry any longer. The Adlets had intended to clean up the fields before his return, and worried that Megahoof's quest hadn't gone well, as he returned so shortly after departing. Judea finished hauling one last load of maki before rushing out to see him. He hugged his wife, and then with a booming voice shared the good news that the Salix trees were not unique to their little glade. He brought back what he thought he needed in order to understand the trees more deeply. He told the others about how dense and full of sap the trunks were, and about the giant gray hornets and pieces of honeycomb he managed to fetch as well. The others listened intently as they briskly sorted the crops from the fields. While sharing the news, he realized just how much food they all had in their little keep, and was stunned how much space it all took. He commended their efforts to make sure it didn't all rot in the fields, and told Sapo that for next spring's crop sowings, they should coordinate, not based upon mere survival, but plant what they think would be wholesome and tasty ingredients for meals instead. Sapo experimented using honeycomb, mixing it with other crops from the farm. He made sure to leave the section of comb that Megahoof said housed the queen so they could start beekeeping. While processing some of the honey into tallow for candles, Sapo realized he wanted to make mead instead, so he set the comb aside and continued with pumpkin fritters. Everyone rushed to store the food, and the haste gave way to complete disorganization. Just heaps of crops strewn about everywhere. Sapo had to run around the keep to find ingredients he needed to cook, but at least for now, hauling was more important than making it easy for Sapo, and Sapo rather enjoyed the odd game of hide-and-seek as well. Sapo realized they had sown tea leaves a little prematurely, because he still didn't know how the elders back home would brew it, and asked Megahoof to find out. He figured the process was likely fairly important, because the leaves were grown in blighted soil, and incorrect preparation might lead to sickness. The last season's pumpkin patch was completely overtaken by ambrosia bushes. The farm plots were planned to be redesignated anyway, so it didn't matter. Both farmers noted how interesting it was that the ambrosia would overtake whatever crops they had sown almost like a weed, but then also perish only after a few seasons. The juxtaposition of both robust and fleeting seemed quite odd, similar to the ebb and flow of pollution in the glade. Megahoof would rather be studying the Salix lab, but he was happy to look into Sapo's request for tea preparation. The tea back home was a staple of the squires' daily diets, and offering it to the squires would bring joy and nostalgia in equal measure. As much as he would like to introduce the tea to his child, as it was very much a part of coastal Adlet culture, the tea was also addictive and probably not safe for children. All of the hill root in the small plot by the bison wilted and withered, suffering from some fungal-based mildew. It was ironic how the only cold-hardy crop the farmers had sown needed to be cut anyway. Soon, all of the fields would be barren, save for the ambrosia and griffin berry trees. Sapo and Lazarus decided it wasn't important to tend the blighted crop just yet, as it wasn't threatening to rapidly spread to adjacent, mostly empty plots. So they sowed more nutrifungus, as they decided it was probably best to keep the farm going in cases of emergency. Now that most of the farming season was over, Lazarus and Sapo would work on cutting trees out of the polluted glade to replenish the keep's dwindling timber supply. Blight was also getting out of hand. Despite the fact that it was late in the season and there wasn't any urgency about lost crop, Lazarus and Sapo drew straws and Sapo drew the short one. He ran around the keep with shears, begrudgingly clipping the blighted crops. Judea had built barrels to help store some of the harvested tea leaves, and having the leaves stored nearby would allow Sapo to more easily brew the special tea. The coastal Adlets had been drinking tea from polluted soil for generations without any ill effect, but it did require special preparation, one that Megahoof worked to reverse engineer. The elders from the coast speculated the tea had some way to break down the pollution, but no real science was ever put to that theory. Megahoof wrote out a detailed recipe for the tea and pinned it to the wall behind the kitchen counter. He told Sapo that if he had any questions or needed clarification, all he had to do was ask. Before Sapo could even gather his breath to thank Megahoof, Megahoof was off to delve into the study of Salix botany. Having spent many days deep underground chiseling out iron ore, Tangier needed to see the sky. She decided to make herself busy by mining some additional granite from the northern outcropping. She could stretch her legs and soak up autumn's sun, and it would also help the masons with their wall. Megahoof took painstaking notes detailing every little process while studying the Salix lab. He extracted sap for experimentation and separated a small portion of it to be distilled with an alembic. Another portion would be set to dry out naturally. He even jarred some sap mixed with water to see if it could be used as preserves. He scraped shavings of pulp from the tree, which wasn't easy as the tree's core was dense and knotted. The salix would make for terrible timber despite its hardness, as it was warped and twisted throughout the core. He mashed the pulp into various mixtures, some he added to distilled alcohol, while others just with water or tea. Every possible combination or variation was exhausted. He planned on combining the extractions with pollution to see if they could either replicate an artificial process or hasten the natural cycles. Sappho decided to steep all of the tea leaves and jar them for later consumption rather than making it piecemeal. The kitchen had kettles and mugs if anyone wished to have their tea heated up, but all the Adlet squires were accustomed to room temperature tea, as coal and timber was quite scarce on the coast and using fuels for warm tea was prohibited. The glade was getting colder, and Judea decided it was time to assemble the hearths in preparation for winter. For once, the Adlets were actually excited for the colder temperatures. It would help to preserve their food in the pantry and free them up for other projects around the glade. Much of the main gate awaited bricks and mortar, timber to be resupplied, bisons sheared, and possibly even exploration or trade. The Adlets loved the pumpkin fritters, but unfortunately they were soon to run out of pumpkin entirely. Sappho was already planning to collaborate with Megahoof about planting for specific recipes the following season. Additional pumpkin patches would be top of the list. Dave wanted to help the other masons with what was left of the main gate's construction, but he knew if he got any more sick, he'd be a liability and not an asset. Bed rest might have been boring, but it was necessary to recuperate from burning lungs and wheezing breaths. The Adlets decided to prioritize the shelf-aged fungus to feed to the bison. The food was likely to be the first to rot, and the bison didn't seem to mind the slimy sprouts at all. What little hay was threshed from the wheat would be stored for later use. As helpful as the windmill was, it couldn't thresh the hay from the wheat and resulted in lost hay. Sappho didn't enjoy milling by hand, but if he had enough free time, it would be helpful to do so for the bison. The Adlets took brief respite to enjoy the solar eclipse. Through the yellowish hazy smog, they could see the bright silhouette of the sun around the largest of the moons. Adlets were able to roughly predict the different eclipses, but mostly when they'd occur and not exactly where they'd occur. Many of the Adlet Kingdom had eclipse day traditions where potential celebrations were planned across the continent and played out like a lottery where only the kingdoms that experienced the eclipse would celebrate. Despite the efforts of the best astronomers, even during the golden age of the Adlet Kingdoms, nobody was able to say with certainty where an eclipse would make landfall. Maybe someday the Adlets could take time to celebrate the celestial concordances, but those traditions have been long dead for centuries. Initially, Dave was concerned with his self-imposed house arrest so he could recover from pollution exposure. His life as a mercenary prior to joining the squires was spent mostly on the move, often fleeing from encroaching monsters. He valued his nomadic independence and largely thought that the communities that attempted to carve out their own enclaves were foolhardy and weak. His opinions were of course changed after he sought refuge in the Bison Glade. He saw the strength and fortitude that the squires had to stand against the tides of darkness, and realized it took more bravery to plant roots than to wander. He busied himself with the menial tasks of the keep, and enjoyed his time spent with each of the squires. The prolonged eclipse got Megahoof wondering what sort of role sunlight could play for the salix trees. He replicated many of his experiments in the dark, keeping the samples in the shelves of his research bench. It never occurred to him to take note whether or not sunlight or weather affected the salix trees. He was solely focused on their cyclical absorption cycles. Those details had slipped his mind. Lazarus enjoyed his time tailoring, stitching, quilting, and weaving to keep his fellow Glade members clothed. He was eager to start forging armor, but knew it took far more time for Tangier to source iron from the tunnels than from the outcroppings on the surface. Now that Megahoof had gone on excursions, he thought maybe it would be possible to arrange for Tangier to head out as well. She'd likely refuse until Shellbell was at least a little older, but it was an idea he'd let germinate in his mind. The farmers decided to harvest the last of the hops. The autumn weather was getting colder by the day, and the crops weren't growing at all. Had they waited, they'd only be risking future beer and ale to be lost to frost, and that simply wouldn't do. Madsy made a joke that the Adlets were a day ahead of schedule. Lazarus looked a little puzzled. so she clarified that since the sun had never risen at all for the day, it was still last night. Tangier complimented her on her astute observation, but that wasn't the laughter Madzi was hoping for, so she looked a little hurt. Megahoof's progress to understanding the Solix tree progressed bit by bit. He didn't expect any epiphanies or revelations to come easily, so he approached his studies with a tempered patience that few other adlets could. He had uncovered some new information, like that it was a complex system of roots, largely responsible for absorbing pollution, but that was already his working theory, so it wasn't exactly a eureka moment. He was nurturing ideas of additional field experiments he'd want to perform, but they were only brainstorms, and he wouldn't make any plans until he had exhausted what he could learn from the slab. Sappho finally tired of running around the kitchen like a field mouse escaping a broom, and decided to optimize his little nook of the keep to make cooking easier. He asked for some additional barrels where he'd prioritize the ingredients he most often used. Judea laughed at the idea that more storage would solve their storage problem, but happily whipped up some more barrels and got on with her day. Sappho loudly announced that the keep had run out of pumpkin, and a collective, saddened sigh seemed to echo back. Loud yowls and hisses reverberated off the keep walls, and Judea called out that she had spotted a chain of lynx to the south. The archers rallied towards the main gate. The archers lost their sense of urgency. The lynx wouldn't have any way to breach the walls, so they could deal with the issue at their own pace. Judea waited patiently for the other lazy archers to join her in defense of the main gate. The archers ventured out of the gate to lure the lynx to them. They decided to stand their ground, which would have been a good tactic had they not all missed their shots. After Arelco got scratched up, they retreated behind the wall. The archers finally put down the last rabid lynx. Unfortunately, most of the lynx showed signs of mange or blight pox as a result of pollution exposure. Quite a waste of life, meat, and leather. Thank you for tuning in to episode 13 of Hedge Knights, Comforts of the Keep. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this with your friends. If you would like to become one of my Patreon patrons, a link to Patreon can be found in the description of this video. If you would like to join my gaming community, a link to Discord can be found as well. Thank you so very much for watching. A special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel and made it all the way to the credits. Thank you so very much. Hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow adlets.